Hi, Huckleberry here, and today we're going to talk about identity theft. Well, exactly what is identity theft and why should you care? Well, if you've been a victim or you want to avoid being a victim, this is something that you better be aware of. So I'm going to start with the 5 different types of identity theft. I'm going to define each one, and then I'm going to go into detail about each one and tell you some stories and illustrations of how it might occur. So the first type of identity theft is financial identity theft. This is the type that most people think of when they think of identity theft, but there are other kinds. Anyway, financial identity theft is when the perpetrator assumes the victim's identity in order to steal money. The next type of identity theft is false tax returns. Here, the perpetrator assumes the victim's identity in order to steal money, specifically through filing a false tax return. And the next type is child identity theft. Believe it or not, children have their identity stolen. Here, the perpetrator assumes the victim, which is a child, assumes their identity in order to steal money. Next, we have medical identity theft. Here, the perpetrator assumes the victim's identity in order to get free medical care. And the last type of identity theft would be character identity theft. Here, the perpetrator assumes the victim's identity so that a crime committed goes against the victim's criminal record instead of the perpetrator's criminal record. Now let's go into each type and talk about how it looks and give you a story that illustrates what that is. So we're going to start with financial identity theft. Now here, typically the perpetrator would withdraw money from the victim's bank account or investment account. The perpetrator may charge money to the victim's existing credit card, or the perpetrator may open new lines of credit, that is credit cards, in the victim's name, and then the perpetrator charges money to the new lines of credit. Lastly, the perpetrator could even buy a home or a car in the victim's name. Now, here's a story as to this actually happened to somebody, and it illustrates very typical type of identity theft. Here, the victim noticed that several $1,000s had been withdrawn from his checking account. He immediately reports it to the bank. Working with the bank, it's discovered that the perpetrator walked into a bank branch in a different city than the victim has ever even been in, and withdrew the money, showing a driver's license as ID. The driver's license was evidently forged, as the victim's driver's license had never been lost or stolen. Soon after, the same victim received a collection letter about a past due store credit card that had several thousands of dollars charged to it. The victim not only had never opened an account with the store, but had never even shopped at this store. What has happened is that the perpetrator impersonated the victim to open the store credit card and then proceeded to charge a couple of $1,000s to the card. Soon after, that same victim received a collection call from a completely different past due credit card. He never even opened an account with that store either. Soon after, the victim gets a bill for a few $100s from a store card that he actually did have. The problem was the charges were for the previous month, but the victim had not used that card in a couple of years. The next type of identity theft that we'll talk about is tax returns. So how does that typically look? Well, the perp takes the victim's social security number and files a fake tax return. The refund check is sent, of course, not to the address of the victim, but to another address that the perp or the perpetrator gives to the IRS. Now, basically what happens here is the victim files his taxes and expects a refund, but it never comes. And the next type what we'll talk about is child identity theft. Typically, how does this look? Well, the first thing to know about it is that it's caused by a weakness in the Social Security system, in that the Social Security number is attached to a name only, not to the person's gender or date of birth. So, if a child is not the only person with their name, it would not be too difficult for a person with the same name to switch and start using that child's clean credit history. Now, very often, you end up finding out that your child has been affected only when they apply for a student loan or for their first credit. Sometimes you find out that your child has been affected when they get bills in the mail. Now, there's a story which is typical, which is that a 2-year-old boy ended up with thousands of dollars in credit card debt and had even filed for bankruptcy. Obviously, that was child identity theft. The other thing you want to know about child identity theft is that it's extremely common, and it is often perpetrated by a member of the child's own family. This could make sense in terms of the names, the way the Social Security Administration deals with names. And next, we'll talk a little bit of detail about medical identity theft. So, how does this look typically? Well, the perpetrator uses the victim's ID for a doctor visit or other medical care or to obtain prescription drugs. Typically, the victim only becomes aware of it after they receive an explanation of benefits, or an EOB, from the insurance company. This is a particularly dangerous type of identity theft because the victim's medical records may be changed. Now, here's an extreme story which I read about, which may or may not be true, but it does illustrate what could happen. A woman victim gets a call from a hospital informing her that her newborn baby has tested positive for illicit drugs. But the fact is, the victim has not had a baby. The worst part is that Child Protective Services threatened to take her real children away, calling her an unfit parent. Finally, the victim ended up having to take a DNA test to prove that the newborn baby was not hers. Finally, we talk about character identity theft. So how does this look typically? Well, you could get arrested for a crime that the identity thief committed. Basically, the perp could be stopped for a traffic violation. The perpetrator gives the cop a fake license with the victim's name on it, and the violation goes on the victim's Department of Motor Vehicles record. Now, here's a sad story, another one that I read about character identity theft. Here, the victim had his credit card stolen. The credit card was then used to purchase and download child pornography from an illegal website. Later on, the website was shut down and the authorities seized its records. When the authorities traced the victim's credit card to him, the police showed up at his door and arrested him. Quite a mess. Anyway, that's the end of this video. This is actually the first in a series of videos that I'll be making on identity theft that will tell you how to avoid being a victim and what to do if you have become a victim. This has been Huckleberry. Thanks for listening.